You're a proponent of effective altruism. That sounds pretty good. What is effective altruism?
So Peter Singer is known as a proponent of this. And I really admire Peter Singer. And I think that he's pretty persuasive on this, which is that though I'm not a utilitarian and I don't agree with him on a lot of other things, I do think that he's right that a lot of people who are in rich countries have the capacity to do an extraordinary amount of good by donating to effective charities, and that it's morally good if they do. And so the idea of effective altruism has two parts. The first is the altruism part, that comes first, which is that it's morally good to give. It's morally good if you're fortunate enough to be able to give. And what they recommend is 10% of your income. And then if you are going to give, once you're like on board with the view that it's morally good to give to people, to promote well-being, to promote people's health, well, where should we be giving? Who should we give to? And you should give to the place where your donation can do the most good. And so charities that I favor as an effective altruist are the Against Malaria Foundation, which mostly focuses on bed nets, bed net distribution, and Give Directly, which is cash transfers to poor families in Kenya and Uganda.
Yeah. How do you figure out who's using the money properly? You know, you always hear a story every now and again of nonprofits that you think you're giving all this money to them and that they're going to, clean water or whatever it is. But then later you find out like 80% of the money goes to administrative costs or for them to throw parties, for fundraisers to just get more money to throw more parties or that.
There's a great website, givewell.com, and GiveWell has a team of researchers which try to evaluate which charities they think are going to be the most effective. And they recommend both Give Directly and the Against Malaria Foundation. One nice thing about Give Directly is that cash transfers are pretty easy to administer. You can just do it over mobile bank transfers. And the Give Directly team has a lot of people who do really good follow-up to see what the effects are. So they can see they'll randomly assign villages to get the transfers, and then they can see the effect of having the cash transfers as a anti-poverty intervention. And it does look like cash is like a very effective anti-poverty intervention.
Yeah. Is this also, in effect, an argument for lowering taxes in general, that if people had more money in their pocket, perhaps 10% more, they could give 10% more to things that they really cared about?
I think that there are lots of good reasons to lower taxes, because I think that currently, like, some of what the government does with taxes is like not great. For example, war. I'm very against war. I don't know that this is the best argument for that.
But that generally, if you had more money in your pocket, you might be willing to give more money to causes that you really care about.
I think people should be willing to give to causes that they care about, whatever their tax rate is.
Yeah.
And I think that people should care about causes that do the most good, dollar for dollar.
Yeah. So you're also writing a book on sex work.
Yeah, it's a for and against book.
That wasn't a great segue there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a for and against book. So I'm the for decriminalization, and I'm writing with a co-author, Lori Watson, and she's against decriminalization. Yeah. So
what's the argument against it at this point? I mean, this is another place that I go very much to the libertarian side, which is that if a woman or a man or whatever wants to take control of their life and be a prostitute or be involved in sex work, and it's an even exchange, and they're doing something for money, I have no problem with any of this.
All right, cool. So, one less person I need to convince.
There you go. All right, so I'm with you on this one.
So who am I arguing against?
Yeah.
There's a lot of people. So some people have a view of like sort of sexual moralism, that there's certain norms that should govern people's sexual choices. That's like a kind of more traditionalist view. I think that people who hold that view aren't entitled to use the government as a means to force everybody else to live in accordance with it. There's a feminist argument. People worry that having sex work, especially pornography, but sex work more generally, will contribute to the subordination and objectification of all women by promoting sexist ideas of female subordination or views of women as objects.
But to be clear, sex work isn't only about women. I mean, there are plenty of men involved in sex work.
Yeah. But feminists focus on the detrimental effects of the sex industry for women as a whole,
Right.
often. There are arguments about occupational health and safety related to the dangers associated with the profession. I don't think that the profession's more dangerous than being a commercial fisherman, for example. But
Right, and aren't there studies that show that, like in Amsterdam, for example, that the women that are involved in sex work are in unions, and that they've been able to bargain for better health care and things like that?
To be sure, I think a better ideal, the policy that I favor, is out of New Zealand, where it's just treated like all other kinds of work. But of course, if you're concerned about the risks, the occupational health and safety risks of sex work, you should be concerned by black markets as well, equally. And black markets are more dangerous. So yeah, there's a kind of traditionalist argument, there's a feminist argument, there's a kind of a labor argument. A lot of people worry that it's exploitative, and by that they mean that if a person makes a decision without having any acceptable alternatives, then though the decision's not coerced, it's not sufficiently voluntary to merit respect. I think that that could apply to a lot of work, a lot of low-wage work especially. People will only choose to take those jobs at the wage that they take it because they lack acceptable alternatives. I think that we should therefore favor a basic income. So I do think that it's a problem that people only choose certain types of jobs or to work at all because they lack acceptable alternatives. And I can talk more about why I favor a basic income.
Yeah.
But I also think that if you don't favor a basic income, the voluntariness concerns don't warrant prohibition of sex work. So if the problem is that people who are choosing to work in an industry only choose because they have very few options, I don't think that an acceptable solution to that is to just straightforwardly prohibit the few options that they do have. This parallels arguments in international global justice about sweatshops, where it's like people like only choose to work in sweatshops because they lack acceptable alternatives. I don't think the solution would be to ban sweatshops or to even enforce regulations that would lead sweatshops to go to another place.
Right. And half the people screaming about it are holding, have iPhones in their pockets, right? I mean, it's just a fact.
And I think that, when people are concerned about these types of labor issues, sex work, sweatshops, they are genuinely concerned for the workers. Like, I don't think that there's a sort of bad faith there. But I would press those people to say, like, well, what is the alternative that goes along with the ban? I mean, it's very easy to say, I don't approve of this circumstance, but then, like, what is your solution, I mean, yeah, like, I favor a basic income too, but, like, failing a basic income, I don't think that further limiting the options of people who are already suffering for a lack of options helps them.
Yeah, so what would a basic income look like to you, done correctly?
Well, I don't take a big stand on, like, how much it should be. Why do I favor a basic income? You might think, like, oh, you're a libertarian broadly, like, why have the government redistributing people's income? And that's what you were saying, like, oh, I'm against, like, a high tax. It's like, I don't really have too much of an opinion on how high taxes should be necessarily per se, or like, but I have more of an opinion on what they spend it on, what public officials spend it on.
Yeah, well, I do agree. It's mostly about spending and not about taxes. We got to cut the spending down, and then the government would just need to take less from you if it would stop overreaching on what it thinks it's supposed to do.
Yeah, and so, like, I'm against a lot of what public officials spend the money that they tax people on, but taxes in particular, I'm a little bit more ambivalent about. I mean, I kind of think, given the political institutions we have right now, like, no, we should oppose kind of raising money to go to war. Like, I think that'd be bad, because I think war is bad. But should we be, in principle, opposed to taxes per se? That's a little bit more complicated. So say that you're a broadly kind of libertarian person. A lot of people will say, that means that, nobody should violate another person's natural rights. But do people have natural rights to not just their bodies, but external objects, property out in the world? So one of my favorite philosophers, Michael Huemer, is kind of like an anarcho-capitalist, and he's like, well, at least some stuff out in the world. If you build a hut, like, in the woods, and, like, you live there, someone can't just, like, roll in and, like, knock it down. Like, you have a natural property to that. But some other property rights are going to be conventional. Some property rights are going to exceed whatever natural rights we have. So, like, money, that's a good example. That's a very conventional system. So now you have a government, and the government says, okay, here's the property system that we're going to enforce. Well, one thing that property system should do is it should respect everybody's natural property rights and natural rights to their own bodies, whatever that is. But then the government goes further and they're like, and also, we're going to enforce all of these property conventions, and we're going to use the coercive power of this government that nobody consented to, like none of us signed up, to enforce these kind of property conventions. And the thing about these property conventions, let's call them capitalism, is that they're going to make people generally better off. But they're going to pick winners and losers. They're going to make some people worse off, some people really, really badly off, some people fantastically well off. So we have the government that's enforcing protections for people's natural rights, but also establishing these property conventions. How are the property conventions enforced? Oh, the property conventions are enforced in part with violence, with coercion, which is a threat of violence against people's natural rights, their rights against being threatened with violence. And so I don't think that, I don't favor basic income as an ideal theoretic solution. I think ideally nobody would use violence against anybody without their consent. But given that we have governments which are using violence to enforce laws and property conventions against everybody without their consent, a basic income is a way of compensating people for that injustice, for the injustice of the enforcement of a coercive property system that enforces conventions the enforcement of which requires violating people's basic rights.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've heard a couple different libertarian arguments for basic income, and on its head, if you were just looking at it, you would think that just makes no sense, and yet I completely understand what you're saying there. What is the inherent problem, though, that once you set this income, and I'm not asking you for the number that you're giving everybody, but once you set this, that just the way economics works, I mean, you're just going to increase the cost of everything else for everybody, right?
So they've seen basic income studies, and I mean, the evidence is weak. Of course, there's not been a full-scale, great, ideal basic income enforced. But
I'm giving you a basic water level before we choke to death.
But there will still be incentives to work, and there will still be positional goods and positional advantages. All the basic income should do, I think, is give people the freedom not to participate in the labor economy if they don't want to.
I guess the thing that I struggle with is that once you set it, that you will always have politicians coming in that want more votes from the people that are getting it, and they're just always going to say, raise it, raise it, raise it. And that every year that goes by, we're just going to raise it and raise it and raise it, and that will raise the cost of everything else. That, to me, is the human part of it that I struggle with, that it's just nature. Every politician's going to be like, well, if I look at my district, we have a lot of people on it, let's raise it, I want more votes.
Yeah, and so I don't think that the basic income, and this is true of basic income advocates across the political spectrum, very few will ever say that the basic income should be raised so high that it depresses the total pie. So you want the basic income to be as high as it can up until the point that it doesn't swing overreach in the other direction.
Right, but is that just not the way politics works? I think that's sort of what I would say is the problem. That I get you, I'm with you. You know what I mean? I completely understand that. But just the nature of the political system, you're going to give them this power to do this, and then always they will raise it. And whatever that threshold is that you're talking about, of course they're going to run over that.
Yeah, but that's going to be true of whatever your kind of political ideals are. Is that you're always going to have to have a concern about these sorts of public choice worries or electoral incentives that are going to cloud people's vision. I'm interested in what does justice require? What's the truth about what justice requires? And I think that a mistake that libertarians often make is that they're sort of question begging in their arguments for having property rights. They'll just be people have rights to their property rights without explaining why, where those property rights came from. And I think that what justice requires does include a respect for certain kinds of property rights, whatever the kind of natural rights are, but that oftentimes the enforcement of a property system far exceeds that. And so, as a matter of justice, the basic income could be a form of compensation for that initial injustice. So that's a very in-principled argument. And you're kind of asking but in practice, wouldn't that really go
I'm just sort of giving you the rubber meets the road one. I get it at the philosophical level for sure.
But then, so you might think well, what's the point of this defense of the basic income if in practice it wouldn't? But you always have to have some kind of ideals about what you think is true about justice, just to ground what are your kind of North Stars for what policies you advocate for now. And so where the rubber meets the road, you might think is, well, now, given that we have this view, how do we assess existing policies? Here's one way to think about this being informative. Think about cash transfers as benchmarks for any kind of assistance program. So like, I think that cash is a more respectful way to help people because it respects their authority to decide how best to help themselves or how to make choices that reflect their own values. And so, you know, whatever intervention public officials want to enforce on behalf of people in order to help them out, let's just hold it up to a benchmark, a per person benchmark of like how people could have used that money individually if you just like sent them that money as a check. And like I think that some programs will probably beat that benchmark, but just thinking in terms of using a cash transfer as a benchmark for evaluating the justice of different things that public officials use redistributive taxation to do, that's like one practical implication of thinking about a basic income as being required by justice.
Yeah, it's interesting. All right, I want to finish strong on critical thinking. Because
Right.
it's a phrase that I mention often on this show that I think if we're lacking one thing in this country more than anything else, it's critical thinking, the ability to think clearly, look at a problem, understand your intellectual opponent's argument as opposed to just what you think their argument is, not impugn everyone's motives. I mean, that's basically what I've tried to do on this show consistently for a couple of years right now. Do you think we're at like a critical thinking disaster moment right now? Like we don't seem to, we don't, like just in the public discourse.
It sounds like you
well,
do.
I think in the public discourse, maybe not when you're with a lot of academics that you're spending time with, but I think the general public discourse really lacks critical thinking. It's like we've picked our sides, we're yelling at each other all the time, we're demonizing constantly, all of that. We're not thinking about issues really clearly and critically.
More so than the past, do you think?
I think partly the internet has caused this, you know, the Twitterification basically of everything and the short way we think about things, and we go from one crisis to the next crisis, or we're outraged about something one day and then we forget about it the next day. You know, even if you look at the shooting in Las Vegas about 2 months ago, you know, I think 58 people dead, it seems like there's almost no information about it. Like we just let it go, we just forget things, which I think is a part of critical thinking. Like we just don't look at things sort of holistically and try to figure out what really is true.
Yeah, although it's, I mean, you might fall into like a sort of availability bias where like you see people on the internet shouting at each other and being mean and like, people kind of acting in bad faith or being hypocritical, and you're like, oof, critical thinking, worse than ever. But then like look at the past which I think like the past was by and large just a terrible place.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not saying it's worse than ever. There's something about it that feels, perhaps because of the internet, worse. But generally, I just don't think we're in a good state right now when it comes to critical thinking.
But I mean, what's your counterfactual? I mean, because like
when was it better, basically?
And so like you might look at the internet now.
I would guess it would. I would say it would probably better around the time of the founding of the country. That the founding fathers, at least when they were writing documents, these were principal documents that they were having, you know, Lincoln, Douglas, that's not founding times, but
I think Thomas Jefferson was a real
debates.
critical thinker there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thomas Jefferson's my favorite founder. What are you going to say about Thomas?
Thomas Jefferson's your favorite founder?
Yeah. What? What do you like about Thomas Jefferson? I love Thomas Jefferson.
What do you mean? What do you like?
I mean, his understanding of liberty and liberalism and what the role of government should be.
I mean, interesting that he's like writing the Declaration of Independence while he is owning slaves, and
you're right.
He was a rapist.
A complex.
He was bad. Like I was not good. I felt
well.
If you're going to pick a favorite founder, I would not pick Thomas Jefferson.
I mean, George Washington owned slaves too.
Yeah, I don't think
and didn't free them till his deathbed. But those are. But that to me, that just shows that these were complex people of their time.
Yeah.
Thomas Jefferson, you're right. He was writing the laws to free the slaves while he owned slaves. And I went to his house in Monticello, and they give a really, I think, very forthright explanation of what his life was like. But I mean, if you go to the Washington Monument, and I was there just a couple weeks ago, and you really read the things that he was writing about, yeah, he was a flawed human. But I mean, there are things that 50 years from now, they're going to look back that we're probably saying right now.
That's exactly right, yeah. And I think that is one of the values of critical thinking, is to try to look around where we are now and be like, okay, we know that in the past, it was like a moral catastrophe for women, for people of color. Like the past was such a bad place, and very likely in people who were really trying to do good critical thinking, like pick your person. I don't know that I would pick Thomas Jefferson, but he's not my favorite founder. People who are really good faith people were making really big moral mistakes. Very likely we are living through a kind of moral catastrophe right now, but we can't see it. And so the value of critical thinking is to say, like, what is that moral catastrophe that's in our midst right now? And I think that there are some candidates that people are talking about, and then there are some things that we might not even be able to imagine. Now, is critical thinking especially bad now because of the internet? Maybe, but maybe critical thinking is getting better because of the internet. I kind of think, like, how incredible that I have access to so much of human knowledge just like sitting in my office. Like,
right. So I guess it is what you make of it.
I can see so many more arguments than I would have seen before. Like before, people sort of only knew the perspectives of their own place and time. Maybe what looks like it's the critical thinking disaster is just that people are exposed to all of these different arguments and perspectives, and that in the past they weren't. And so, like, yes, there's more conflict, but there's also potentially more progress on the same dimension. I don't know. I didn't.
Yeah, no.
I sort of like took a turn with that answer, but like when you mentioned that there were products at the time, maybe we're living through a moral catastrophe. There's a nice paper about moral catastrophe that I think like, does illustrate the value of maybe both critical thinking and a sort of epistemic like humility, like a sort of like maybe we're also really getting it wrong in this way.
Yeah, maybe we'll do a whole other show on the founders together and Thomas Jefferson.
I'm not an intellectual historian.
That's just really interesting to me, and obviously we don't have to end this in perfect agreement on that, but I think it's interesting because to me, Thomas Jefferson, everything I've ever written, his thinking was perfectly clear. It doesn't mean that the person that he was not flawed, and by 2017 standards, we know he was having sex with a slave, which in effect is rape because he had the power over her. So I get it. And yet, at the same time, as I said, was writing the laws to free them, was doing so much goodness for people to own their lives and be individuals and have the country that we have right now. And I just think it's, so that's why I love him.
But there were also like abolitionists, at the time and throughout history who were getting it right. And so, I mean, I think that when we think about...
I think he was trying to nurture the system through a horrible phase, basically. You know what I mean? Like, yes, there were abolitionists that were more openly abolitionists than he was as he was part of the government, but he was also trying to not destroy everything at once because there was a lot of goodness in the system, too.
Yeah, I did not expect this to take... This took a real turn outside my wheelhouse more, but...
But in effect, critical thinking, it's maybe there's an internet piece of it that makes it sort of better and worse at the same time.
Yeah, I think that one thing that sometimes happens in these sorts of debates is a sort of like relativism where people become like very suspicious about like thinking about the moral truth or like there being a moral truth, and think like, oh well, true for the time or true for that place or true for that person. And then there's like this sort of like second step where people are like, so like who's to say? Like, like we'll just have a sort of like, we should all just be tolerant of everybody else's viewpoints, and like we shouldn't like cast judgment on people with whom we disagree in any sense. And I think that's true, that you should have a sort of robust tolerance just for people expressing different kinds of viewpoints. But I also think that that doesn't mean that there's not like a right answer. And like there definitely are right answers. They're just really hard for us to know. And like sometimes when people disagree or when people on the internet are like, oh, like being mean to each other, I guess, people think like that sort of cast doubt on like anybody being right about anything if you want to be the person who says that like people shouldn't be mean. But like, nope, like I think that there's like a truth about like the right and wrong answer about these questions, about moral questions and political questions, about justice, about what we should do. But that part of that right answer is that we should have more tolerance, that we should be tolerant of different viewpoints. But that's something that's a moral claim too. Like we shouldn't have like a kind of, I think we should resist a move to relativism from the view that like we should be respectful of disagreement. You know,
Yeah,
like
I am completely
like
with
those
you.
two things are different.
Listen, I'm completely with you on that, and I'm always for more tolerance in the truest sense of what tolerance is, not fake tolerance that we often see these days. I think we should, since you're already co-authoring a book where you're taking one side and another side, we'll do the co-authored Thomas Jefferson book. There you go. I'm just planting the seed. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. And for more on Jessica, follow her on Twitter. It's @MissJessica. That's a great. How do you get that Twitter handle? That's a good one. And check out her book, Pharmaceutical Freedom.